This is the video presentation for Thursday, August the 20th, 2020. Now, yesterday we had placed in our notes about the various Native American tribes that we would be responsible for as we got ready for Quiz 1. Now, of all the Indian tribes we need to study, we probably need to give a little bit more input into the Aztecs. Now, we know the Aztecs lived in modern-day Mexico. We know that the Aztecs gave human sacrifice to honor their gods. We also know from yesterday that their architecture was outstanding, their knowledge of mathematics was better than Europe, as was their knowledge of astronomy. So, who again is civilized and who again is not civilized? Here's a short feature on Aztecs.
According to history, a wandering tribe of nomads arrived at Chapultepec around the year 1248. This vicious culture was barely able to survive by feeding on snakes and vermin, and they were driven around the Mexican Valley by other tribes in the area. In 1325, however, they stopped their migratory patterns when they came upon Lake Texcoco to build one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. These people were the Aztecs.
Seeing the sacred symbol of an eagle perched on a cactus eating a snake, the Aztecs knew this was the location of their homeland. This was a sign that Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, would show to his chosen people. Today, the lake is drained, but at the same time of the Aztecs, Lake Texcoco was enormous. On a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs overcame many architectural obstacles and built one of the largest cities in the world.
The capital city, Tenochtitlan, was built with orthogonal city planning. The city was laid out in a grid pattern divided by canals and with rectangular plots of land and houses between. 4 main zones, or compound, were each divided into 20 districts. As the Aztec Empire came to dominate other tribes around Mexico, Tenochtitlan covered an estimated 5 square miles. The city was connected to the mainland by 3 main causeways, leading north, west, and south of the city. These causeways were interrupted by openings that allowed canoes and other traffic to pass freely, and removable bridges that also served a defensive purpose.
For construction, the Aztecs did not use beasts of burden or pulling carts. Although the wheel was known to the Aztecs, they failed to use it in conceptual design. The insufficient technology of the region in that time period called for sheer manpower. Materials for building were brought from the mainland using the strength of peasants and slaves.
The Aztecs utilized the environment of the lake as much as possible. Using the dirt and water, they created adobe houses. They also created chinampas. Chinampas were artificial islands made of piles of lakebed mud and plants the Aztecs created around their city. On the chinampas, farmers grew corn, beans, squash, other vegetables, and flowers.
The Aztecs had no contact with European cultures before the 15th century. Great architectural minds such as Tezozomoc and Chimalpopoca devised new architectural innovations such as the aqueduct. Even though this invention is credited to the Romans, the Aztec aqueducts were the first in the New World. 2 double aqueducts, each more than 4 kilometers long, made of terracotta, provided Tenochtitlan with fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec.
One of the greatest factors affecting the architecture was the religion of the Aztec culture. The Aztecs believed that if they did not please the supernatural beings above, the sun would not rise. To keep in favor of the gods, the Aztecs offered up the greatest sacrifice: human blood. The Aztecs sacrificed approximately 20,000 people a year in order to please the sun god.
These offerings took place on sacrificial temples that the Aztecs built. These temples were pyramids that looked identical to the Egyptian pyramids, except for the fact that they had a flat top where the sacrifices could be held. The construction of a new temple would not take place on an empty slot. If the new temple was constructed in the place of an older temple, the older temple was not destroyed. Rather, the new temple was built over the other one. The builders would add extravagant new layers to the old temple. Along with the temples, the Aztec built similar shrines wholly devoted to their gods. In Tenochtitlan, perhaps the most famous structure is the twin-stair pyramid, the Templo Mayor. This pyramid had 2 staircases and summit temples, each dedicated to a separate god. As the Aztecs dominated tribes in Mexico as far as Guatemala, they also built shrines, temples, and pyramids across their vast empire.
Generally, the Aztec cities had a multi-leveled, semi-democratic system of government. Formed in 1428, the Aztec Empire had immense emphasis on territorial expansion. Aztecs forced conquered peoples to pay tributes and taxes. Areas within the empire were organized as city-states, each ruled by a king from the dynasty. In Tenochtitlan, the wisest and most powerful leaders of each family constituted a city council. These leaders in turn selected 4 main members. One was selected to be the Tlatoani, or leader in the city. The ruler was named the Great Speaker, and served as the empire's main administrative, military, and religious leader. The second person in charge was a person named Woman Snake, who was actually a male. He was also the person who controlled the law and order. Over time, a belief formed that Tlatoani was a descendant of the gods. The emperor's power was supreme.
In 1431, Tenochtitlan allied with Texcoco and Tlacopan to create the Aztec Triple Alliance, which called for the division of any spoils of war into 5 parts, 2 parts of which would go to Tenochtitlan, 2 parts to Texcoco, and 1 part to Tlacopan. The Triple Alliance would dominate the Valley of Mexico for the next 100 years. However, Hernan Cortez and the Spaniards landed on the Gulf Coast in spring of 1519. Cortez allied himself with the Aztecs' enemy, the Confederacy of Tlaxcala, and battled Tenochtitlan on June 1520.
And from there they keep on going about Cortez, and I would like to wait until we get to lesson 2 to worry about that. Obviously, they presented you with a lot of material in a short amount of time. What I am concerned about, though, is let's say that I decide to give an essay question in which I ask you to take a side. Do you think that the Aztecs were civilized? Do you think the Aztecs were uncivilized? And explain your answer. Now, of course, you would have to pick one or the other. You couldn't do both. And then, of course, you would have to give examples. This is pretty common in college level essay questions. The answer is always an opinion, but you are given points based on how you support your answer. We know that by the late 15th century, that would be the 1400s, Europeans are going to begin to land in North America. And what we're going to see from lesson 2 to really lesson 32, the last lesson that we have, is a systematic destruction of the Native American tribes. Well, what did the century of, or when did the century of the Age of Discovery begin? Now, in European history, we have what is known as the Age of Discovery. And typically that's the 15th century or the 1400s. And it extended into the 16th century, the 1500s. What nations came out the big winner in the Age of Discovery? And what do you base this on? Now that in itself would make another good essay question in which you could pick a multitude of European countries, and you would be right depending upon how you backed up your story. So most essay questions we're going to answer are not list this or tell that. Most of them are your opinion and how is it backed up. Well, the travels of the Europeans became a coordinated plan in the 14th century, or 1400s or the 15th century. Generally from about 1450 to 1550, we call this the Age of Discovery. Now, for our purposes, we are going to look at just a few of the people who are in this age. There were many, many more. As you write down the names, make sure you write down what country they represented and what area they discovered. Now, for our purposes, I'm not really too concerned about first names, but I am concerned about last names. Now, when we get ready to take our quiz, I will give you a term sheet that has most of these individuals down. Now, of course, I won't tell you which one is from which country and which one did what. That is your responsibility. Created at the end of the Middle Ages, the Age of Discovery is part of a bigger world history time called the Renaissance. Now, the Age of Discovery is going to be when European cultures are going to come to dominate North America, Africa, and Asia. So what led to the Age of Discovery? Well, the Age of Discovery was created by a need for spice and the spreading of faith. Well, what do we mean by a need for spice and a spreading of faith? In the 12th century, that would be the 1100s, Pope Urban II called upon European nations to gather their knights, travel to the Holy Lands, and kick the Muslims out. Now, all totaled, there would be 4 crusades. Only 3 of them would arrive in the Holy Lands. And in only one case would the Christian knights be successful. Now, this took over 200 years. And in the end, it is status quo. The Holy Lands are still controlled by the Muslims. But over the course of these 200 years, European knights had traded with Muslim traders. And the back and forth trading opened up markets in what is today the Holy Lands. Well, that's the reason for the religion, but what about the spices? Toward the end of the Crusades, we have what is known as the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague is going to kill off 1/3 to 1/2 of all Europeans. Now, we're pretty sure about this number because in most cases, records are going to be kept of births and deaths by various churches through the area. Now, it's called the Black Death because as you get sicker and sicker, the blood under your skin begins to coagulate and you have a blackish appearance. Now, they have no idea what caused the Black Death. At least they had no idea back then what caused the Black Death. They did not know how to cure it. They did not know how to stop it. And so a lot of supposed remedies were created. The belief was that if one was to take spices and rub them on your body, that the Black Death would not visit you. Well, where are these spices? These spices are found in the Middle East, in where the Holy Lands are. So, we need to go to the Holy Lands not to conquer them, but to buy spices that we can use to stop the bubonic plague. Now, by the way, do we know what the bubonic plague is today? Yes. Do spices stop it? No. Bubonic plague is passed on by fleas jumping off of diseased rats and then jumping onto you, biting you in the mixing of the blood. By the way, there is no cure for the bubonic plague even in the 21st century. The Muslims had their market in the Holy Land, and the Muslims are going to trade with people from India and people from Asia. Now, The Italians had already created an overland route to China, courtesy of Marco Polo. Now, Marco Polo left Venice as a very young man, and he and family members walked to China. They traded for goods, and then they walked back to Venice as very old men and made a fortune. From their travels, they are able to develop what is called the spice lane. The spice lane, by the way, is still with us today. To get to the Holy Lands, Europeans had to travel through Italy. Now, if you want to get to the Holy Lands through the Mediterranean Sea, you had to travel through Italy. Now, the Italians would charge you an arm and a leg to use their boats. Well, you might say, I know, I'm going to build my own boats and I'm going to sail to the Mediterranean. Well, the Italians had the largest navies of this time and could destroy any of the ships that you might have launched. Coming out of this were the Portuguese and the Spanish. Now, the Portuguese and the Spanish had united to drive out the Moors. The Moors are Muslims who had come across the Mediterranean Sea and had occupied most of the Iberia Peninsula. The Iberia Peninsula is where Spain and Portugal are today. You can see from this drawing where the darker shade of green is where the Muslims were at the beginning of the Age of Discovery, and the darker shade of green is where they ended, say, around the 1550s. Excuse me. It was in the 1550s that the Pope is going to call for the extermination of the Moors. This is what we'll call the Spanish Inquisition. Now, in Portugal, in the royal family, is Prince Henry. Now, Prince Henry will become king in the future, but while still a prince, he will go to the city which he is from, Lisbon, and he will create a school that is a collection of maps and ship drawings and ideas of how to get to Asia and India. Most scholars of the day recognized that the earth was a sphere. Now, Prince Henry believed that if one was to sail to the west, one would eventually encounter the east. But how big a round of a sphere is the earth? Nobody knew. Others said no, that if one was to sail along the coast of Africa, that eventually they would go around the tip of Africa, and on the other side of Africa would be Asia and India. Now, if you went to Prince Henry School, you learned navigation, you learned map making, you learned seamanship. One of the first things to come out of Prince Henry School was the caravel. Now, this is a picture of a caravel. Now, you might be saying, well, what's so special about this ship? Most ships that were built in those days were built to go on the Mediterranean Sea, which does not have many storms. And to propel the ship from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, there would be men who would be chained to their oars, and they would row the boat. Now, of course, you could only row the boat for so long, and then you would have to be replaced. Well, when you took these Mediterranean ships out on the Atlantic, the waves were much higher, and the ships would be sunk. So what the Portuguese discovered, that if the size of the ships were raised, what we call the gunnels, they could withstand the rough seas of the Atlantic. Then they said, why don't we use wind power? Now the wind is much stronger along the Atlantic coastline than it is in the Mediterranean Sea. And so the caravel was born. Now, of course, as time went on, the caravel got bigger and wider, and the gunnels were higher to carry more cargo. In 1488, a Portuguese by the name of Bartholomew Dias is going to sail down the coast of Africa. One day, he wakes up and the sun rises on the left side of the ship and sets on the right side of the ship. The next day, the sun rises on the west side of the ship, on the right side of the ship, and sets on the left side. Obviously, he has gone around the tip of Africa. He refers to this as the Cape of Good Hope. Now, by the way, I would never ask you, in what year did Dias go around the tip of Africa? What I would ask you was, did Dias do this before or after Columbus? In this case, he did it before. I would ask you to trace the route of Dias, or maybe I have already traced the route and you have to tell me which one is Dias and which one is another age of discovery. Or I might ask you to explain, who did Dias do his exploration for? The Portuguese. In 1497 and 1498, another Portuguese sailor by the name of Vasco da Gama is going to sail from Portugal around the Cape of Good Hope to India and back. Now, when he returns from India, his boat is loaded with spices and herbs and precious jewelries and silk. The King of Portugal now is a somebody. Well, Spain says they would like to follow the Portuguese. And the Portuguese said no. They said, this is our route. And the Portuguese said that if you try to follow our route, we are going to go to war with you. Now, the last thing the Pope needed was two great Catholic countries at war with each other just after they had fought a war to kick the Muslims out. So the Pope created the line of demarcation. Now, this was Pope Alexander VI. No, you don't have to remember the name of Pope Alexander VI. All you need to remember is the line of demarcation was made by the Pope. Now, here is a map of Africa, Europe, and the two Americas. And the lighter line is the line of demarcation. And then a treaty line was created just a couple of years, another year later. Now you can see that Brazil is a part of South America, but it is under Portuguese control. That is why the people who live in Brazil speak Portuguese, while the rest of South America speak Spanish. Well, what are the Spanish to do? Along comes Christopher Columbus. Now, Columbus was an Italian sailor from Genoa. But the problem was Columbus had lost his ride. He couldn't get anybody to pay him to pilot their ships. So Columbus is going to travel to Spain, and he's going to talk to the new king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, and he is going to suggest to them that if they were to come up with some money and give it to him, he would go buy some ships. And then these ships would sail westward, and eventually they would arrive at the east. Now, the old wives' story is that Isabella hawked her jewels, and that's what was used to pay for the trip. Now, whether that's right or not, I don't know. In 1492, Columbus will leave with 3 small ships. Now, Columbus will stop in the Canary Islands to take on more water and take on more food. Now, Columbus knew how long he could go before the food and the water ran out. Now, when Columbus got to that point, he had still not discovered the New World. And so he asked his men for another week. Now, how do we know this? Because he wrote everything down in his log. 2 days into this extra week, a lookout on the Nina, a sister ship, yells, "Tierra, tierra," land. Columbus will land on this. He will stab his sword into the ground, and he will claim this land for Spain. A mass of thanksgiving will be offered. Now, unbeknownst to Columbus, there were people already living on the island that he came across. Columbus believed that these people probably were from the western part of the country of India. So in his log, he referred to them as Indians. Now, Columbus would make a total of 4 voyages to the Indies. On each of his voyages, he took with him a map maker by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. Now, Vespucci's maps were considered the finest of anybody in Spain or Portugal. And Vespucci signed his maps with his first name. And so when other Spanish people wanted to come to the New World, they would insist on America's maps. And that's how we got our name. North and South America are named in honor of Amerigo Vespucci. It became apparent to everyone except Columbus, that Columbus had not discovered the New World. He had not discovered the Indies. What he had discovered was new land. Now, this new land will become a beacon for future Spanish explorers. This is an artist's drawing of Vasco Balboa. Now, Balboa had accompanied Columbus on all 4 of his voyages. And Balboa believed that if Columbus had gone just a little bit farther to the west, he would have discovered even more land. So that's what Balboa did. Balboa went farther to the west and landed in what is modern-day Panama. He was told by the Native Americans that there was a great body of water on the other side. Now, the distance between the Atlantic and the Pacific in Panama is less than 80 miles. So after a week's journey, Balboa saw the Pacific, and like Columbus, he took his sword out and plunged it into the ground and claimed all of the land that the Pacific Ocean touched for that of the Spanish people. Well, who then eventually was able to go around the world? Now, it is called circumnavigate. And in 1522, a Portuguese sailor sailing for Spain, again like Columbus, he had lost his right, is going to go to prove that Columbus was right. Ferdinand Magellan will leave from Spain. He will go down the east coast of South America. He will go through the treacherous Cape of Horn. He will travel through the Pacific. He will land in what we today call the Philippine Islands. Now, it is in the Philippines that disaster struck, when Magellan is going to be attacked by native Filipinos, and he will be eaten. Now, we know all of this because Magellan's brother was on board the ship and saw all of this. Magellan's brother will then take the ships that remain. They will sail to the tip of Africa, up the coast of Africa, and back to Spain. This journey of about 4 years will prove that the earth is round. Now, by the way, if I was to ever ask you about Magellan, You got to remind yourself that even though Magellan was Portuguese, he sailed for Spain. Spain was the country that was paying his bill. So that is the country who gets the credit. Was Columbus the first European to discover the New World? No. In the 11th century, that would be the 1000s, a Viking by the name of Leif Erikson is going to land in what is modern-day Canada. Now, we know from North history that Leif Erikson was sailing to Iceland, but his ship got blown off course by a tremendous sea, and he landed here in what is today Labrador, Canada. Now, about 60 years ago, archaeologists are going to do digs along the coastline, and they're going to find Viking cities. So why do we not celebrate Erikson for being the first to discover the New World? Because he didn't write any of it down. And because of that, we cannot give him any credit. Well, where do we go from here? Well, the next thing we need to do is we need to look at the French and the Spanish and what they did in the 1600s, that would be the 16th century, the 1500s, to conquer the Americas. That is lesson 2.